Hi, this is Jeffrey Williams, and welcome to Too Late for the Gods. Today we're going to take a look at a video that was recently on S.J. Thomason's channel. And it featured a guy named Steve McCrae, who seemed to have an argument with another producer over the gumball argument. The gist of it is Steve's objection to having agnostics count as atheists. In a final analysis, it's a distinction without a difference, but let's take a look at Steve's argument. I've condensed it as much as possible. It was difficult. There's so much bloviation, self-aggrandizement, gossip, appeals to authority, no true Scotsman fallacies, but I've shortened it as much as I can to get the gist of his argument. Then we'll come back and take a look at it.
A lot of atheists misusing that analogy and taking it too far. Because what they do is they confuse the no middle ground between belief and disbelief, or excuse me, belief and non-belief, right? So it is either the case that you believe or you don't believe. So if the gumbos are in a state, and the proposition is that they're even, there must be an ontological fact of the matter that they are either even or odd. There are no other choices. That's a strict logical dichotomy. Would you agree?
Yeah.
Okay. Nobody was really going to argue otherwise of that, right? We're assuming that these are whole quantized gumballs. We're not going to run the whole thing. Well, maybe the gumballs don't exist. Maybe they're in superposition, right? Let's kiss, right? Keep it simple, stupid thing, right? So let's assume that they're just, the propositions are even. Now, if I say to you, hey, look, Steph, I don't have a way to even evaluate this proposition. I look at the gumballs, there's a whole bunch of them. There's no evidence one way or another. And I say, look, I don't believe that your proposition that they're even is true. It doesn't mean I'm asserting that it's odd, right? But there is no middle ground between belief and believe and not believing. I either believe that they're even or I do not, period. But there is a middle ground between believing they're even and believing they're odd, right? If you believe something, you think the proposition is true. If you disbelieve the proposition, you think it's false. That's what it is in epistemic logic. We're talking about multi-valued logics. And in multi-valued logics, normally in a proposition, it's either true or false, the law of exclusive. But in multi-valued, you have another one called U, which is unknown. So a proposition can be true, false, or unknown. It's a third state. Doesn't exist in classical, but it does exist in multi-valued logic. And Matt chimed in, you're wrong. That's what he wrote. You're wrong, if I'm recalling correctly. And I'm like, well, what am I wrong about, Matt? He's like, well, you either believe or you don't believe. I'm like, that's irrelevant to what we're talking about. We all agree that. I have this happen the other day. Somebody's still telling me, you believe or you don't believe. I'm like, nobody's arguing against that. That is a straw man argument. That's an effigy you're building up to relate something that nobody's ever said anyways. You either believe or you don't believe. But there are things like multi-valued logics. And there's also a middle ground between believes P and believes not P. They keep insisting that I'm wrong because I'm espousing to them philosophical understandings and the logic. And they're going, well, Steve's wrong because reasons.
That was a lot of words to say what SJ was able to put into just a few, because in the final analysis, it doesn't come to much more than this.
Yeah, no, I want to say, because that's what you said. I think this is one of your biggest contentions. And you had it in your blog, as you said, you don't like it when people say, because you're an agnostic, therefore you must be an atheist, essentially.
Anglo-American philosophy long ago retreated from the big important questions to trivial logic games, and obsessing over whether or not agnosticism and atheism are the same thing is an example of how analytic philosophy has long sheltered many a mediocre mind. Watch now as Steve falsely claims the normative philosophical use of the terms atheism and agnosticism. While vehemently protesting he is not prescriptive in this usage, he attempts to claim a privileged position for his supposedly normative usage to prove those with contrary definitions to be wrong.
And so I get vilified, and they say, well, look, Steve is saying atheism is only one thing, the belief that God does not exist, which has never been my argument. I've never argued that. I say this is what is normatively held in philosophy. Accept it, don't accept it, use your own definitions, whatever. But when you tell me that that definition does not exist or it's wrong, because they do that, then you're out to lunch. What the atheists have been trying to do, and this goes back probably around the days of Anthony Flew, back in like 1972. He wrote a paper called The Presumption of Atheism, which has been thoroughly annihilated. He didn't even believe his own paper. He became a deist later on.
Yeah.
But they try to change the normative understanding of the word atheist in philosophy. And even Flew points this out. In philosophy, the way atheism is understood is the positive epistemic status, or the belief that God does not exist. He wants to change it. He wanted to change it and argue in the negative. Dr. Michael Martin does the same things. Dr. Stephen Bullivant does the same thing. They want to argue that they want to put in the negative, and that is non-standard. It is atypical.
Steve, you had to admit there are philosophers with contrary definitions of atheism and agnosticism to his, but he seemed to have just simply dismissed them. If there was an argument in there, I didn't catch it. So let's check with the world-renowned logician for a ruling.
By fiat, by ipsa dixit. Oh,
Steve has this backwards. Flew, Martin, and others argued for dividing atheism into the categories of strong atheist and weak atheist. The former denoting those who affirmatively deny the existence of God, the latter for those who simply lack belief, including agnostics. There was nothing groundbreaking here. Steve's supposedly groundbreaking argument, however, that agnosticism is not a category of atheism, seems entirely lifted from the 2017 entry in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy by a professor at Purdue University named Paul Draper, who argues for a separation of agnosticism from atheism. First, it should be noted that articles in the SEP are not prescriptive, but opinions by individual philosophers and professors of philosophy. Anyone who thinks there is agreement on such terms among philosophers is ignorant of philosophy's history as a long and cacophonous argument. Let's take a look at the history of the word atheism. It's always useful to look at the etymology and first usage, as words tend to become corrupted over time, usually through polemics or misunderstanding. The term comes from a Greek word of about 5th century BCE, atheos. The a prefix simply means without. It doesn't mean anything else but without. It literally means without a belief in God or godlessness. Compare this to the words amorality, which simply means without morality, versus immorality, which means anti-morality. The same works with atheism, which is not necessarily anti-theism, but simply without theism, and has been understood as such for millennia. In recent times, some philosophers have decided to replace hard and soft atheism with atheism and agnosticism. Paul Draper is an example of that, but to little effect. Agnosticism still implies, without theism, a change of words or categories with no real difference. As I will show later, the whole question itself is misguided in the same way that the gumball analogy is an inapt metaphor.
Then you have a modal scope problem, because when you say you must be either atheist or theist, that only exists in the what's called relative scope. It's a relative necessity given the choices, but modality-wise to the whole, it's not the case. There are other positions other than theist or atheist when you accept more sensu stricto or sensu strictissimo definitions, which are in academics normative.
Steve dismisses the gumball argument as a modal scope fallacy, which sure sounds impressive, but misses the same point that the gumball analogy itself misses. There's a crucial difference between the gumball argument and a belief in God, and it actually does concern a relationship between epistemology and ontology, as Steve suggests, even if he didn't understand how. With the gumball example, we know the gumballs exist because they are in the sensible world. We also know that the number is either even or odd, but cannot tell which just by looking at them. The question is one of state of being of known objects and property categories. The question of God is entirely different. It's a metaphysical assertion of something we cannot sense in the way we can gumballs. In distinction to the question of state of being, which is objectively knowable, the God question is a question of being itself, which is not testable. In such cases, we are right to exclude belief without further evidence. The evidence in this case, however, isn't binary and multivariable logic, which, while sounding impressive, has no application here. Instead, there is a continuum of belief from positive acceptance to outright rejection and everything in between. Most people consider belief as an acceptance of a proposition strong enough to be willing to act on it, and everyone has a different threshold for that determination. With a metaphysical assertion, no real knowledge is possible, nor is any decisive objection. As Bertrand Russell pointed out in his teapot argument, the nice thing about metaphysics is you can assume anything you want and defeat any objection merely by defining it away. Unlike the gumball analogy, where the position isn't gumballism or agumballism, and instead we question a known physical issue, the question of God allows of no logical determination. And again, we are perfectly in our right to reject beliefs simply on the grounds of lack of evidence. Nothing more needs to be argued. Seen in its proper light, agnosticism is on the without God continuum as properly understood as a segment of that atheist continuum. So why even bother redefining agnosticism as apart from atheism? For Steve, I could only guess, maybe he just needs the attention. For apologists like SJ, however, the answer is clearer. First, it's an attempt to shift the burden of proof to atheists. Since theists fail at every attempt to prove their God's existence, they try to put atheists in a position of disproving a metaphysical assertion, which Russell showed to be impossible. Through Steve's sleight of hand, they think they can try to claim that denial of their God is the positive claim, and the onus is on atheists to prove the non-existence. When we see through the logic games, though, it's clear that the question is purely an ontological issue of a metaphysical assertion, which cannot be anything other than the positive claim. Second, theists are threatened by the dwindling number of Christians and seem anxious to remove agnostics from the count of atheists as if there were some sort of election on a horizon to determine the issue. Again, it's pointless, as the simple reality is that fewer and fewer people identify as Christian, which is the only question they are concerned with, and no matter how you classify agnostics, they still aren't Christian. I hope this at least stimulated some thought, and I invite anybody with questions or arguments or comments to join me on my blog, which is linked below. There will be an open item for discussion of this issue, and thanks for watching.